Elvis staggered through the glass doors of Ruth's diner on Beale Street, his stomach cramping from 3 days without a proper meal. The autumn rain of 1954 had soaked through his thin jacket, and his worn-out shoes squelched against the black and white checkered linoleum floor. The smell of fried chicken and fresh biscuits hit him like a physical blow, making his knees weak with hunger. He had exactly 17 cents in his pocket, not enough for even a cup of coffee, but the warmth inside was too precious to abandon. What the elderly black waitress behind the counter did next would create a bond that lasted 23 years, transforming both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Ruth Washington had been working double shifts at her own diner for 8 years, trying to keep the doors open after her husband Samuel died in a factory accident. The insurance money had long since disappeared into medical bills and funeral costs, leaving her to run the small restaurant alone with nothing but determination and the recipes her grandmother had taught her in rural Mississippi. At 62 years old, Ruth had seen plenty of hungry young men drift through Memphis, but something about this particular boy with the slicked-back hair and desperate eyes reminded her of her own son, James, who had died in Korea 2 years earlier. The boy was trying to look casual, pretending to study the menu board while his stomach growled audibly in the quiet afternoon lull between lunch and dinner rushes. "You hungry, baby?" Ruth called out, her voice carrying the warm authority of a woman who had fed countless people throughout her life. Elvis looked up, startled, his pale face flushing with embarrassment at being so transparent in his need. "Yes, ma'am, but I'm just looking right now," Elvis replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been raised to be polite, especially to his elders, but admitting he couldn't afford to eat felt like swallowing broken glass. The pride that had carried him through childhood poverty warred with the hunger that was making his vision blur around the edges. Ruth studied his face for a long moment, taking in the hollow cheeks, the way his clothes hung loose on his thin frame, the desperate hope he was trying so hard to hide. She had fed her share of struggling musicians over the years, young men who came to Beale Street with nothing but dreams and determination, sleeping in flop houses and surviving on one meal a day when they were lucky. But what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of asking to see his money or directing him to the mission down the street where free meals came with mandatory prayer services, Ruth simply said, "Sit yourself down at that booth in the corner, honey. Mama Ruth's going to take care of you." She pointed to a worn red vinyl booth that had been repaired so many times with electrical tape that it looked like a patchwork quilt, but it was clean and private, away from the windows where other customers might stare. Elvis hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where the 17 cents felt impossibly small. "Ma'am, I appreciate the kindness, but I can't pay for much right now. Maybe just some water and I'll be on my way when the rain stops." "Did I ask you about money?" Ruth said, her tone gentle but firm. "I said sit down, and that's what I mean. Nobody goes hungry in Ruth's place, not while I'm breathing, and these old hands can still work." She was already moving toward the kitchen, her movements efficient despite the arthritis that made her fingers ache on cold days like this. Elvis slid into the booth, his guitar case propped against the wall beside him like a faithful companion. The vinyl was warm from the heat register nearby, and for the first time in weeks he felt safe enough to let his guard down slightly. Through the kitchen pass-through, he could see Ruth moving with practiced precision, seasoning and tasting, her movements carrying the rhythm of someone who had been cooking with love for decades. 20 minutes later, Ruth emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate that made Elvis's eyes widen in disbelief. Fried chicken, golden and crispy, creamy mashed potatoes with a well of brown gravy, green beans cooked with ham hock until they were tender and flavorful, and 2 buttermilk biscuits that were still steaming from the oven. She set the plate in front of him along with a tall glass of sweet tea so cold that condensation immediately began forming on the outside. "Ma'am, this is too much," Elvis protested, even as his mouth watered uncontrollably. "I can't accept all this. It's not right." "Baby, you let me worry about what's right," Ruth said, settling her considerable bulk into the booth across from him. "My grandmother used to say that food tastes better when it's shared with someone who needs it. You eat every bite of that, you hear me? And don't you dare think about paying me back with money. There are other ways to repay kindness in this world." Elvis took a tentative bite of the chicken, and his eyes immediately closed in pure bliss. It was perfectly seasoned, crispy on the outside and juicy within, better than anything his mama had ever made, though he'd never say so out loud. As he ate, Ruth asked gentle questions about where he was from, what brought him to Memphis, what he hoped to achieve with that guitar case that never left his side. "I'm trying to make it as a singer," Elvis admitted between bites, his voice gaining confidence as the food restored his strength. Been playing around town, trying to get noticed by the record companies. Sun Records is just down the street, and I've been trying to work up the courage to walk in there and audition. Music is a hard business, Ruth said thoughtfully, but I can tell you got something special about you. There's a light in your eyes when you talk about singing. That light don't come from nowhere. It comes from having something real to say. But Elvis wasn't finished eating, and Ruth wasn't finished talking. Over the next hour, as Elvis slowly consumed every morsel on his plate, Ruth shared stories about the musicians who had passed through her diner over the years. She had fed blues legends who were broke and hungry, country singers who were trying to cross over into new audiences, and jazz musicians who played the clubs until dawn and then came to her place for breakfast when everywhere else was closed. Some of them had made it big and moved on to bigger cities and fancier restaurants. Others had given up and returned to their hometowns, but they all remembered Mama Ruth and the kindness she had shown them when they had nothing. The thing about dreams, Ruth said, refilling his tea glass without being asked, is that they need nourishment just like your body does. You can't chase something that big on an empty stomach, and you can't keep faith when you're cold and hungry and scared. Sometimes the kindness of a stranger is what keeps a dream alive long enough to become real. When Elvis finally finished eating, he felt more human than he had in weeks. The food had restored his physical strength, but Ruth's words had done something even more important. They had reminded him that he wasn't alone in his struggle, that other people had walked this path before him and survived. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you," Elvis said, his voice thick with emotion. "This meal, this kindness, it means more than you could know." "You thank me by not giving up," Ruth replied simply. "You thank me by walking into that record company and showing them what you can do. And if they don't appreciate what you have to offer, you keep walking into other places until you find someone who does." And that's when everything changed. The next day, fortified by Ruth's meal and encouragement, Elvis gathered his courage and walked into Sun Records. The audition didn't go well initially, but he kept returning, persistent and determined, fueled by the memory of Ruth's kindness and her belief in his potential. And every day for the next 6 months, he returned to Ruth's diner. The routine became sacred to both of them. Elvis would arrive around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, during the slow period between lunch and dinner, when Ruth could sit and talk without neglecting other customers. She would prepare his meal without asking what he wanted, varying the menu but always ensuring he got the nutrition he needed to keep pursuing his dream. Sometimes it was meatloaf with cornbread and collard greens. Other days it might be pork chops with sweet potato casserole and black-eyed peas. Always there was sweet tea, and always there was conversation that nourished his spirit as much as the food nourished his body. Ruth never asked about payment, and Elvis never offered money he didn't have. Instead, he began bringing his guitar to the diner, playing softly in the corner booth while Ruth worked, his music becoming the soundtrack to her. Afternoon preparations. He played gospel songs that reminded Ruth of her childhood church, country ballads that spoke to her heart, and blues numbers that captured the struggle they both understood intimately. "You getting better every day," Ruth would tell him, pausing in her work to listen when he tried a new song or worked out a difficult passage. "Your voice is finding its own way, not trying to sound like nobody else. That's what's going to make you special." Other customers began to notice the daily concerts, staying longer than they had planned, just to hear the young man with the unusual voice sing songs they had never heard performed quite that way. Word spread through the neighborhood about Mama Ruth's singing boy, and people started timing their visits to coincide with his informal performances. But what happened next became legend. In July of 1955, almost a year after that first hungry afternoon, Elvis's persistence finally paid off. Sam Phillips at Sun Records paired him with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black for what would become the legendary recording session that produced That's All Right. The song became a regional hit, then a national sensation, transforming Elvis from a hungry dreamer into the most talked-about new performer in America. As his career exploded beyond anything he had imagined possible, Elvis never forgot Ruth's Diner, or the woman who had kept his dream alive during its most fragile period. Even as he traveled for concerts and recording sessions, he made sure to stop by Ruth's whenever he was in Memphis, always taking the same corner booth, always insisting on paying for his meals now that he could afford to do so. "I don't want your money," Ruth would protest, but Elvis had developed his own form of stubborn kindness. "And I don't want to eat for free when I can pay," he would reply with that crooked smile that was becoming famous across the South. "But I'll keep coming back as long as you'll have me, because this place feels more like home than anywhere else in the world." By early 1956, Elvis Presley was a household name, selling records faster than RCA could press them, attracting crowds wherever he appeared, earning money that seemed impossible for someone who had been counting pennies just months earlier. His face was on magazine covers, his music was dominating radio stations, and his concerts were selling out in cities across America. But Elvis saw something no one else noticed. Ruth was struggling to keep her diner open despite its growing popularity among music fans who came hoping to see where Elvis Presley used to eat. The building was old and needed constant repairs that she couldn't afford. Equipment was breaking down and being held together with improvised fixes. Most importantly, Ruth's health was declining from years of working 18-hour days, standing on her feet in a hot kitchen, carrying the weight of financial stress that never seemed to ease no matter how hard she worked. In March of 1956, Elvis made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. He called Ruth and asked her to meet him at the diner on a Tuesday afternoon when they could talk privately. When she arrived, she found Elvis sitting in their usual booth, but instead of his guitar case, he had a manila folder and a serious expression that she had never seen before. "Mama Ruth," Elvis said, using the name that had become natural to both of them over the months of friendship, "I want to talk to you about something important, and I need you to hear me out before you start arguing with me." Ruth slid into the booth across from him, her weathered hands folded on the table, her dark eyes studying his face with the shrewd intelligence that had helped her survive decades of hardship. "I want to buy this building," Elvis said without preamble. "Not to change anything or take it away from you, but to give it to you, free and clear. No mortgage, no rent, no worries about losing the place that's been your life's work." Ruth's mouth fell open, but Elvis continued before she could speak. "For 6 months, you fed me when I had nothing. You gave me hope when I was ready to give up and go back to driving trucks. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You fed my body, but more than that, you fed my dream. Now, I want to feed your dream." What he did next became legend. Elvis opened the manila folder and pulled out papers that his lawyers had prepared, documents that would transfer ownership of the building and the business to Ruth Washington, along with a bank account containing enough money to renovate the kitchen, repair the building, and ensure she never had to worry about expenses again. "I can't accept this," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. "This is too much. This is your money, your success. I just gave you some meals." "No, ma'am," Elvis said firmly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority Ruth had used with him during those hungry afternoons. "You gave me my life back when I was about to lose it. You showed me that kindness still existed in the world, that there were people who would help a stranger just because it was the right thing to do. Every success I have from now on, every record I sell, every concert I play, it's all built on the foundation you gave me in this little diner." Ruth cried harder than she had since her husband's funeral, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Elvis's generosity and the realization that she would never again have to choose between buying groceries and paying rent. "There's one condition," Elvis added with a smile. "I get to keep eating here whenever I'm in Memphis, and you can't charge me for the sweet tea. That's non-negotiable." Ruth laughed through her tears and reached across the table to take his hands in hers. "Baby, you'll always have a place at this table, and there'll always be a plate waiting for you. But I got a condition too. You don't ever forget where you came from, and you don't ever stop helping people the way you're helping me today." And that's when everything changed. The story of Elvis's gift to Ruth spread throughout Memphis and beyond, becoming one of the most beloved tales of his generosity. Ruth's Diner became a pilgrimage site for Elvis fans from around the world, but Ruth never exploited the connection for profit. Instead, she continued the tradition Elvis had started, feeding struggling musicians who needed a meal and encouragement more than they needed payment. Ruth lived for another 21 years, running her diner until she was 83 years old, always keeping that corner booth reserved for Elvis whenever he was in town. Even during his Army service and later when his career took him to Las Vegas and Hollywood, Elvis made sure to visit Ruth's whenever possible, always sitting in the same spot, always ordering whatever Ruth wanted to cook for him. But there was one more twist coming. In 1977, just 3 months before Elvis died, Ruth was diagnosed with heart disease that would require her to stop working. At 81, she could no longer stand for hours in the hot kitchen, could no longer carry heavy trays, could no longer maintain the pace that had defined her life for decades. When Elvis learned about Ruth's condition, he immediately made arrangements for her care, ensuring she had the best medical treatment available and enough money to live comfortably in retirement. But Ruth had a different request. "I want to pass the diner on to someone who'll keep feeding hungry musicians," she told Elvis during what neither of them knew would be their last conversation. "This place was built on kindness, and it needs to stay that way." Together, they found a young couple who had been running a small cafe in North Memphis, people who understood the importance of Ruth's mission and promised to continue the tradition of helping struggling artists. Elvis provided the funding to train them in Ruth's recipes and methods, ensuring that the spirit of the place would survive even after Ruth retired. Ruth Washington died peacefully in her sleep in 1979, 2 years after Elvis's death. Her funeral was attended by dozens of musicians whose careers had been sustained by her kindness, including several who had become famous and returned to Memphis specifically to honor the woman who had believed in them when no one else would. Today, Ruth's Diner still operates in the same location, still serving comfort food to musicians and music fans, still maintaining the corner booth where Elvis and Ruth shared so many conversations about dreams, determination, and the power of simple human kindness. A small plaque on the wall tells the story of their friendship, but the real memorial is the tradition that continues. No musician goes hungry at Ruth's, regardless of their ability to pay. The legacy of Elvis and Ruth reminds us that kindness is often a circular investment. Ruth fed Elvis when he was hungry and hopeless. Elvis fed Ruth's dream when he had the resources to do so. Together, they created a place where kindness could flourish for generations, where struggling artists could find both nourishment and hope during their darkest moments. Their story proves that sometimes the most important transactions in life don't involve money at all. They involve one human being, recognizing the need in another and responding with generosity, creating bonds that last lifetimes and legacies that outlive us all. Ruth fed Elvis's body when he was starving. But more importantly, she fed his spirit when he was ready to give up. In return, Elvis fed her dream of running a place where kindness mattered more than profit, where struggling people could find the help they needed to keep pursuing their goals. If this incredible story of mutual kindness and lifelong friendship moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of helping others when they need it most. Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness that changed your life? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that reveal the best of human nature.